All right, we're back. Oh, we're back again. Oops, that's not us. That's us. Okay.
Yep.
And
Good evening, everybody.
good evening. I'd like to start with a little disclaimer that there's something on our live feed on the channel that says it's waiting for us. If you go back to the main channel, you found us. If you found us, you don't need to know that. So why am I telling you this?
Well, we have a URL up that's on the chat in
The live chat.
live chat. So go to that URL and then click on it, and then you'll find us.
If they're here, they've already found us. Never mind. We're going to talk to you tonight about something which is kind of a little more close, a little more recent, a little more uncomfortable than some of the things we've talked about in the past. And that's
the Japanese American incarceration and internment in World War II.
There's a little bit of a linguistic thing here over whether
Huge linguistic
internment is the right term. Incarceration implies that you have it.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll be able to clear this up, because there is a legal term known as internment. We won't get there quite yet, but we'll explain why there can be some confusion here.
By the way, your mouse died.
What?
Would you please start talking to the fine people?
It's turned off, Jerry.
Keep going. Talk to the nice people.
Okay. Well, yesterday, which was Tuesday, February 19th, was the 77th anniversary of the signing of a particular executive order. Actually, it's called Executive Order 9066, that Franklin Roosevelt signed in February 19th of 1942. And this executive order called for the exclusions of all people of Japanese ancestry, citizen and non-citizen.
No.
Or
alien
as they put
and
it,
non-alien.
Alien and non-alien.
You know, why don't we go ahead and take a moment and let's look at a video which was produced by the U.S. government in 1942. This is a video that was made to explain the process from their standpoint. And there's a lot of comments we can make, but let's go ahead and look at it, because I think...
Yeah, because it explains some, but this is a video, actually it was a film that was made in 1943, about 42, 43, that documents what was happening.
All right, so here we are. Oops, no, here we are. We need a live technical director, you know that?
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous, but no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move. This picture tells how the mass migration was accomplished. Neither the Army nor the War Relocation Authority relished the idea of taking men, women, and children from their homes, their shops, and their farms. So the military and civilian agencies alike determined to do the job as a democracy should, with real consideration for the people involved. The Army provided fleets of vans to transport household belongings and buses to move the people to assembly centers. The evacuees cooperated wholeheartedly. The many loyal among them felt that this was a sacrifice they could make in behalf of America's war effort. In small towns as well as large, up and down the coast, the moving continued. Now they were taken to racetracks and fairgrounds where the Army almost overnight had built assembly centers. They lived here until new pioneer communities could be completed on federally owned lands in the interior. Santa Anita Racetrack, for example, suddenly became a community of about 17,000 persons. The Army provided housing and plenty of healthful, nourishing food for all. The final movement began. At each relocation center, evacuees were met by an advanced contingent of Japanese who had arrived some days earlier and who now acted as guides. Naturally, the newcomers looked about with some curiosity. They were in a new area, on land that was raw, untamed, but full of opportunity. Now, this brief picture is actually the prologue to a story that is yet to be told. It will be fully told only when circumstances permit the loyal American citizens once again to enjoy the freedom we in this country cherish, and when the disloyal, we hope, have left this country for good. In the meantime, we are setting a standard for the rest of the world in the treatment of people who may have loyalties to an enemy nation. We are protecting ourselves without violating the principles of Christian decency. And we won't change this fundamental decency no matter what our enemies do. But of course, we hope most earnestly that our example will influence the Axis powers in their treatment of Americans who fall into their hands.
Now, in polite terms, that is a load of crap.
Yeah. I really hope that you are aware of how this film was being made by the government.
Well, we didn't have propaganda in this country, did we?
Yeah, we didn't have propaganda in the United States. Guess what? You just saw a very potent example of propaganda. When you start taking it apart, and Jerry and I, as filmmakers, we've watched that clip a lot, and we always find new things in it. The upbeat music, the editing,
they're so
the
happy apples for everybody,
waving, handing out apples, the concept of this pioneer village that everyone was going to. It was absolutely horrifying to watch this and then read the examples of the people who were in the camps.
Okay. By the way, this film was made really for the purpose of educating the American public as to what was going on.
Right.
And one of the things that is very carefully being done is saying, look how humanitarian we are. But they wanted to show that the living conditions were Spartan, which they were,
right,
because there were accusations that said, oh, these Japanese Americans aren't sacrificing for the war the
right,
way we
everybody
are.
Yeah, everybody in America had ration stamps and couldn't buy sugar and could only buy so much butter a week, etc. And there was a fear in the general public that these people were being treated a little too nicely, which was far from the case.
We did have a question from one of our viewers that said, was George Takei in one of the camps? George Takei was in a camp rower in Arkansas when he was a child.
Mm-hmm.
We actually, we're going to get to this in a minute. The first historical project we worked on was a documentary on this project. And we contacted George Takei's agent about having him actually do an announcing for us. And they wanted more money than our station had.
Yeah.
And we actually had, this is kind of embarrassing, and this is in the early 1990s, about 1990.
Yeah, this is 1989.
Okay. There was also somebody else who said, he's gay. You shouldn't use him. He's gay. It wasn't known to the public, but it was known enough that they actually said, don't do that.
Yeah.
But that said, his agent, who I spoke with, I said, well, would he be willing to do something like this? To which he said, he can't shut up about it.
In fact, just a couple of years ago, George Takei helped to create and fund a Broadway show called Allegiance on his experiences in the camps.
Okay. So I want to get on, because we've got a fair amount of meat to cover here. And I want to start with, there are basically, as we said in our teaser and so on, there are 4 basic excuses, justifications, explanations for what happened. And these were military necessity, race prejudice, war hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. 3 of those had some real impact on it.
Yes. The first one, military necessity, was the excuse given at the time. This was a military necessity. This was the excuse that was written into Executive Order 9066, calling for the evacuation. The 3 that follow, race prejudice, war hysteria, and the failure of political leadership, come from a report that was written in 1983.
83? Okay.
Yes, 1983, about the experience, and was presented before Congress. And these were the three important excuses that they came
Well,
up
these were
with.
the explanations, and there's been a lot of debate over which one, what is the factor? Okay, military necessity. The case could possibly made that some people believed there was a military necessity at the time. There wasn't, and we'll get to that in a few minutes.
Right.
But race prejudice, war hysteria, the failure of political leadership, they certainly all played into it.
Yes, and
They were all
all of
factors.
them were, in fact, in place in places like California, Washington State, and Oregon State before the war.
Yes.
And so, war hysteria, yeah, but racial prejudice and failure of political leadership, you bet those were present before the war.
So I wanted to start with a couple of little basic theses before we get too far into it. One of them was, there's about 110,000 people, 2/3 of them were American citizens, were placed in these camps. Basically, they were told, you're unsafe in a military zone. That means everything west of the Rockies.
Right, except that they were not all taken out of the West Coast. Two of the camps were in California, Tule Lake and Manzanar.
Actually, Idaho, no, sorry, I'm going to challenge you here. Everything except the Arkansas camps were technically in the exclusion area.
Oh, okay.
But that said, Hawaii, which is where Pearl Harbor happened, they actually were not placed in the camps there. And that was actually entirely because they had a different leader, different military commander in charge there.
Right.
And he looked at things differently.
Especially because the Japanese Americans, or actually Hawaii was still a territory, not a state at the time. And the people of Japanese ancestry were the ones who grew the food. They owned many of the farms.
It is still actually the largest portion of the population in Japan, or in Hawaii to this day, are people of Japanese ancestry. And so you can't round up everybody. This means, it's morally important as long as practical, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. So a little disclosure, we are from the West Coast. We did grow up around one of the camps. I visited it a few times.
Tule Lake.
Tule Lake, pretty unpleasant. We did make a film on this topic in 1991. It was somewhat controversial at the time.
It was very controversial at the time.
That too. And we were thrashed in the Los Angeles Times and the San Jose Mercury, the Chronicle, a little bit. The Sacramento Bee wrote really nasty stuff about us. Yeah. And actually, the Los Angeles Times, a reporter called me and said, "What's going on?" And I explained, I said, you're being railroaded. But it's not a story. Anyway, and it's not a story. And so I could sit here and whine about how political issues were involved. But the story we're going to talk about tonight is what happened to cause, rounding up 110,000 people, thinking this is a good idea. Okay.
Now, when because we made the documentary in 1988, 89, 90, 91, we interviewed a lot of people who were in the camp. Those people have sadly died. So we have, we created an archive of some very important oral histories from the people who were involved.
And learned more than a little bit in the process. So let's go on and let's start talking about the issue of military necessity. And what does that mean to anybody? Was there a military necessity? You got something? Because I'm going to jump in.
Well, because there was an attack on Pearl Harbor, of course. The details are quite well known, of course. It was an attack that no one was expecting. It was an attack that frankly, most of the American war planners didn't think could happen. They didn't think that the Japanese Navy could actually get as far as Hawaii, but it was a carefully planned attack, and they did make it. Unfortunately, one of the reasons why the attack was so absolutely deadly was that the political leadership and the military leadership in Hawaii were afraid more of saboteurs than of a direct attack, or they would have had a different arrangements of the ships, and they would have
been the planes in particular, and
they would have been waiting for this attack and better prepared.
Actually, to be real clear about this, these were the two commanders, Admiral Husband Kimmel
and Short.
Kimmel and Short were both basically held accountable for not being prepared, for not doing enough to prevent the attack. They were both forced out of the military almost immediately In 1999, Congress held a bunch of hearings because Congress likes to do that. And they said, well, maybe not. Maybe they deserved this. You know, they did everything they could. But they were totally blamed for everything.
Yep.
And why is that not playing? I don't know. Anyway, so you have the Japanese attack on December 7th, 1941.
And December 8th, Franklin Delano Roosevelt declares war on Japan.
Also on December 8th, a gentleman by the name of John L. DeWitt returned to San Francisco. He was the commander of the Western Theater of Operation, and he was a flaming racist.
Oh, yeah.
Extreme racist. And on the 8th of December, there was a squadron of planes from the Alameda Naval Air Station that made a wrong turn, flew over San Francisco. He said, we're under attack. He ordered a lights out, a blackout. And one of the stories, and this is a bizarre story, but one of the stories that circulated almost immediately. So they black out all the lights. There's planes flying overhead. There's people panicking. And no, the Japanese could get planes to San Francisco, but people didn't know they could get them to Hawaii either.
Right.
So this was kind of new. So one of the homes of Japanese Americans, there was a light flashing.
No, it wasn't in the Japanese American home. No.
That's the way I heard the story. Let
Okay.
me finish.
All right.
Okay. And they were people, the local people said we were watching them. They went outside, they watched this light flashes. It's obviously Morse code.
Right.
They went back, they checked on it again. It's Morse code. Somebody eventually got up and knocked on the door.
They sent police in, knocked on the door.
And they found out they were actually having a party, and that was the refrigerator light every time somebody was taking a beer.
Every time the door was opening, the light would go on, and they hadn't put up the blackout curtains very.
But this isn't military necessity, but this is war hysteria.
Right. This is how hysterical people got at this time.
And you've also got something called the Battle of Los Angeles, which they actually made a movie about called 1941.
1941. A movie that most fans of
Steven
Spielberg want to forget. It stars John Belushi. I thought it was a crazy, funny film, but most people, are not that.
In February, the Japanese did successfully attack an oil platform off the coast of Santa Barbara. This is, the only time they attacked the U.S. mainland, apart from some skirmishes in Hawaii.
No, and
and Alaska.
And the bombs.
Pollution.
And
the firebombs.
And the firebombs.
Okay. So while they actually, basically, you can see in that picture, there's just a chunk of a scaffold that they knocked out, and that was all the damage they did. The postcard on the lower left of your screen is a Japanese postcard that was made celebrating this glorious victory and how they had left the city of Santa Barbara in flames.
Because the radio report from the submarine to the Japanese commander said Santa Barbara is in flames. Not quite.
And I want to be clear here.
Yeah, but it was an attack from the deck gun, which was a 5-inch gun. So the shells did only very minor damage. But because nobody thought the Japanese could get that close, it really panicked people.
Yes, and I want to be careful, and we actually, part of the controversy we got into when we made a film involved the footage of Pearl Harbor. I guess I'll go ahead and share that story with you, which is that we had been telling the story, and we started with footage of Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And then the response and the rounding up of Japanese Americans was in response to Pearl Harbor. Mm-hmm. We ran a test screening for a high school in the little town of Cottonwood, California, and asked people for their reactions. And they said, well, yeah, but the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And so, of course, we had to round them up.
Right.
And it was like, I didn't make this clear. Those are the Japanese. These are the Japanese Americans. And I couldn't get through to them. And we actually decided to cut the footage out.
We talked about Pearl Harbor.
We actually had Japanese Americans talking about the reactions to Pearl Harbor.
Exactly.
But we cut this footage out, and the reactions changed. So we screened it for another classroom. People didn't react this way. However, the Pearl Harbor Survivors Group
got wind that, or at least had heard that we had cut out Pearl Harbor entirely.
And they introduced legislation to ban the showing of our film.
Yep.
They said any educational film, and this was made by the California Department of Education, that talks about Japanese internment must include Pearl Harbor. Which basically was saying, don't show this film.
Yeah.
Now, for the record, it was introduced into the legislation. They had a good laugh. They said, that's not how we work here.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I wanted to mention this because while Japanese Americans were people just like everybody else in America, the Japanese government was pretty bad at this time. They were committing, honestly, some of the worst atrocities
of the war
in history up until that time. You know, they got the Chinese and the Russians and the Germans just beat them later, but it's not a contest. But we had, you know, the rape of Nanjing or Nanking, in which 500,000 people, between 50,000 and 300,000, most of the experts, a lot of people were slaughtered. The Bataan Death March happened in early 1942. The siege of Singapore happened when, you know, they went in, they took Singapore, which was a British territory, and they slaughtered people.
Yes.
I don't know what caused the Japanese army to be this.
That's not something we've studied. However, here's part of the problem. Japanese Americans.
There's a difference.
There's a difference. And
So-
it was exasperated by the political entity on the West Coast and what had been happening
But-
with immigration.
We're locking up these people because of what
Yeah.
the Empire of Japan did in China.
Right.
Okay, this is a little unclear. So I wanted to talk, that's a little bit about the war hysteria and the military necessity. Part of the backstory on the military necessity involves our friend, Mr. DeWitt, who made a couple of, he was one of the biggest champions of this, you know, as he said, there isn't such a thing as a loyal Japanese. I can't read this. Oh, sorry.
It is impossible to determine their loyalty by investigation. It just can't be done.
This, folks, is what we call race prejudice. If
Right.
you say that every Japanese, you can't tell them apart.
We can't tell them apart, so we might as well lock them all up. This was the attitude of General DeWitt.
And General DeWitt was the commander of the Western Theater of Operations. His boss was the Assistant Secretary of War, John J. McCloy.
Right.
John J. McCloy had a relatively distinguished career. He was, Assistant Secretary of War. He had investigated sabotage during the First World War.
Black Tom explosion.
He later
Yes.
became governor of occupied Germany and so on. But he made the famous comment, if it's a question of the safety of the country and the Constitution, why this Constitution is just a scrap of paper to me. This was in a meeting with Attorney General Francis Biddle, and when they basically made the decision, let's round them up. I have the quote here from Harold Ickes, the Secretary of the Interior, who said, I've been told that he's reason, and I'm inclined to believe that he's a fascist.
Yeah.
So these guys were basically saying, war effort. We have to protect ourselves no matter what. Now, let me know if any of this ever sounds familiar.
Okay.
We have to. The
We keep
Constitution's
forgetting
a scrap of paper.
Right.
These things aren't important. What matters is the safety of the American people.
We've heard that
Somewhere.
recently. Yeah.
So I wanted to back up a little bit and go back 1941. Let's go back 50 years
Okay.
and talk about the history of Asians on the West Coast, because it is, for people like us who currently live on the East Coast, it's, not that familiar
It's
with it.
distant and it's historical, and we don't think about it. But on the West Coast, everyone thinks of the left coast and liberal California.
These are pictures from earlier in the process, which were basically rather anti-Asian. It was, after the Immigration Act of 1924, illegal for Asians to immigrate to the country at all.
Exactly. They stopped all immigration.
It was also illegal for Asians to ever obtain American citizenship unless they got through on a loophole by
that they had fought in World War I.
Okay. The far left poster, you see the Japanese rising sun on the man's collar, and how James D. Phelan, if reelected, will hold them.
Far right.
Far right. I'm sorry. One of my screens is backwards here. James Phelan was once mayor of San Francisco, son of a gold rush. There's a lot of stuff in San Francisco still named after Phelan.
Yep.
But he was quite the racist, and for the record, he lost that election.
Good.
Okay. So we have this history of race prejudice on the West Coast.
On the West Coast.
And these are Chinese images, but many of the people couldn't see the difference, or basically lumped them all together.
Right.
Chinese, of course, were brought into California to work on the railroad. And
They were, many of them earlier on, before the railroad, had immigrated to participate in the California Gold Rush. So they were not the workers brought, they were people who had enough means to come to California to look for gold.
Okay, but if you look at the Thomas Nast cartoon on the right side of your screen.
On the left side?
On the left
Right.
side.
Left side.
The right
Yeah.
side. The right side,
okay.
yes. The Thomas Nast cartoon, you can see cheap labor is about to slaughter St. Crispin, the Chinese-American question. The attitude was there were too many Chinese Americans. We had to get rid of them because they were providing cheap labor and undercutting the value of American workers. Let me know if that sounds familiar at all.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just a
St.
little.
Crispin is being shown there. For those of you who don't know, St. Crispin has nothing to do with Henry V. St. Crispin was a 4th century Christian martyr who was a cobbler and was working while cobbling shoes together, and he was beheaded. And that's why that image of the Japanese
Sure.
or the Asians beheading him, destroying the labor. And
So this clearly shows a background of race prejudice and a background of the failure of political leadership. There were also some particular points about the West Coast that made it particularly vulnerable. Number one, it's big. It is impossible to actually patrol every single inch of the California, Oregon, and Washington coastline. That would be very, very difficult. Number two, it's a heavily wooded area. And one of the few semi-successful efforts by the Japanese military to attack California and Washington and Oregon was the idea of setting the forests on fire. Therefore, you would have to bring workers in, or people from jobs working in the military process, to put out these forest fires. So they had sent up incendiary bombs that were on hot air balloons. They were launched from submarines, and they flew into California, Washington, and Oregon, and they had literal bombs on the basket and were timed that they would blow up. Now, most of them landed harmlessly. They didn't work. One was found by a family out on a picnic near Mount Hood in Oregon.
yes,
And
it's a good story, but it's off topic.
Yeah. Anyway, so, well, we have to mention that the West Coast was particularly vulnerable.
Okay. This gentleman, once again, that's a beautiful quote. The very fact that sabotage has not taken place to date is a disturbing and confirming indication that such action will be taken. Sorry. You could get a job on Fox News.
Yes.
Okay. This is General DeWitt again, who he at one point said we need to round up German and Italians too, because we're at war with them. Somebody pointed out two things. One, there's a lot more. Could have included your ancestors at that point.
And
number
ancestors.
two, not on the West Coast. Absolutely.
Okay. Anyway.
But number two was somebody said, but that's Joe DiMaggio's mother. Joe
That's
DiMaggio. We can't do that to Joe DiMaggio. Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio?
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, so there were circulating stories throughout the press of possible collusion or sabotage being planned by the Japanese military, or being helped by fifth columnists inside America.
These stories are still around. In fact, Michelle Malkin published a book where she pulled up two obscure references and tried to claim that this justifies. By the way, there's no evidence, there's no confirmed evidence of Japanese Americans participating.
Exactly.
However, even if there were, it doesn't justify rounding up those little kids I showed you.
There were, in the later reports after World War II, the FBI had gotten 600 leads on possible sabotage and or espionage by Japanese Americans. They investigated every single one of them, and none of them panned out. Now, the
Japanese did have spies, didn't they?
Yes. They hired African Americans
and white people. They fired and disgusted labor people. They hired people who were immigrants. Are typically very loyal Americans. Now here's fifth column. I assume everybody knows roughly what that means.
Right.
Here's a disturbing political cartoon by Dr. Seuss of all people. Just found this today. I didn't know he had done that. Theodore Geisel, Dr. Seuss, was pretty progressive on a lot of issues. He fought for rights for certain people, was very anti-Nazi. But here you can see, honorable fifth column. Yes, we've even got a little whatever there.
Anyway.
And all of these pictures lining up and being passed out dynamite while they're in California, Oregon, and Washington. Basically, he was calling for it. A lot of people were calling for it. And now we get into the issue of the war.
Oh, Bud's asking about fifth column.
Bud does not know what fifth column is.
Okay. Fifth column, the story goes that the general is reporting to the king that the city is surrounded. There's a column on the right, there's a column on the left, there's a column in front of us, and a column behind us.
For the record, the general's name was Francisco Franco. This is based on a real story that happened in early 20th century Spain.
I didn't know that. Yes. Okay, so the city has 4 columns of soldiers coming at it, and he reported about the fifth column, the people inside the city who are performing espionage. So the fifth columnist becomes the shorthand for spies, saboteurs, wreckers, etc. Now, the stories that were going around about Japanese-American collusion basically never panned out. Or there was very good reasons for that.
Like the refrigerator?
Like the refrigerator. Like the Japanese-American store owner that was found with a cache of 500 weapons in his home. What they didn't point out, and this was in the newspapers, what they didn't point out was the Japanese-American owned a sporting goods store. That was his, he didn't have 500 guns. He had, a few guns that he was selling as part of his stock, and he lived above the store. So you can see how these stories grew and grew over time. There was reports of Japanese Americans in San Pedro, California. Pedro, sorry. Anyway, I grew up in Northern California. We didn't talk about that. In San Pedro, California, and they had shortwave radios. They all had shortwave radios, but it was because they were fishing families. They had shortwave radios at home and shortwave radios on the boats.
Okay.
They had licenses for them so that they could communicate back and forth.
I did want to talk about something else, because there's another factor here which does involve the military, which is that from December 7th until May of 1942, the Americans consistently lost battles throughout the Pacific.
Yeah.
Things were going bad. People were scared.
And the people generally got their news from the radio, but their visual news, they got in newsreels that came to local theaters. And people went to the theater really often if they could afford it, at least once a week. And they'd change these newsreels once a week.
They had exciting announcer voices that were talking about, look how kind and compassionate we are.
And thankfully, some of these newsreels are on YouTube, so you can find them. However, when we went looking through the National Archives at these newsreels, and there are certain collections of them that are available, you can see that every week they were releasing more pictures of Pearl Harbor.
Sounds like September 11th.
Yes, and it was just like September 11th. Every week, the government would release a few more pieces of footage or still images, and every week trying to get that anger built up in the American people.
Yes, okay. So I wanted to talk about, so we're losing the war and our government is fighting a war, and these are government propaganda posters that were put out. And they're pretty offensive racial stereotypes. Some of it, Tojo, who was a ruthless killer, did wear glasses, but certainly the portrayal is pretty offensive.
Yeah.
And these are government posters. The government is basically encouraging racism, which happens a lot in war because it's what you do in order to get people, in order to get people fired up to fight. So that's going on. Here's a pamphlet that came out on how to tell Japanese Americans from Chinese Americans, and I'm sorry, they can't pronounce the letter L. Line people up, say a lemon. Oh, you lock him up. Okay.
Yeah.
This was actually for servicemen who are in the fields because Chinese were considered allies and Japanese were considered enemies.
And yeah. Anyway, so that's still more part of the background of race prejudice. But let's get, I think we've
pretty much worked in what we really
things.
haven't gotten into is the failure of political leadership, which does include people like John McCloy. And it ultimately goes all the way to Franklin Roosevelt.
Right.
Because Franklin Roosevelt signed the order. He knew what he was doing. The buck stops there, even though he wasn't the one who said that. And, you know, one of the arguments has been made that it was expedient. He just needed to get people to stop complaining about this so we could concentrate on the war. The United States is fighting a two-front war, which is very difficult.
Yeah, almost impossible.
But one of the things that's interesting about this and disturbing is I don't find evidence of anybody at this time, except for a few church leaders, standing up and saying, this is not okay. This is a bad idea. And that's what, to me, leadership is. Being willing to risk your position. You're asking your soldiers to risk their lives. Shouldn't you be willing to risk your political career to say, no, this is not okay? Because let's go back right there. That's pretty black and white, if you'll pardon the pun. No person shall be denied of life, liberty, or process without due process of law. And so nobody was standing up. And we're going to get into, in a second, into the issue of the Supreme Court challenges, which initially also backed it up.
But at the time, that very early part of the war, the West Coast governors were screaming.
Get them out of here. Oh, yeah, if you bring them to my state, I'll have them hanging from every tree. That was the governor of Idaho. I'll have them hanging from every tree. Don't bring them here. Don't NIMBY.
Yeah. And so what basically happened was the decision, well, just round them up. Give the evacuation orders. I don't think when they first started the process, they were really thinking concentration camps. What they wanted to do was exclude people.
Okay,
but they had no
April
facilities.
They did. By April, they had already started constructing the camps. Initially, there was a plan to just remove those dangerous, to move people out. To the order signed by Roosevelt said, you know, from military areas, that could have meant move everybody 50 miles away.
Right.
Now, technically, everybody was told you have until, I think they were told it depended on the city. You were given effectively 2 weeks.
Yeah.
You can leave within 2 weeks, or we will take other steps, which means, by the way, you live in Seattle, Washington. You've got to get to the others, you and your family, and you own a house, you have a business. Everything has got to go across, and you got to find a place to live.
Right.
On the other side of those mountains.
Yeah. Now,
which, for the record, I've met 2 people who did. They lived in Chicago throughout the war.
Yeah.
Clifford Ueda and
yes.
Sam.
Some people left on their own if they could, but gas rationing kept people from jumping in their cars and driving. People owned homes. People owned businesses. People owned farms. 40% of the vegetables that were grown on the West Coast for the entire United States were grown by Japanese American farmers. Now, the Japanese American farmers had a particularly tough time, if only because they were asked to stay longer than everybody else. That you had a whole bunch of farms that had just been planted. And
April,
that they left them until a week before the strawberry harvest, which is around late May, early June. And so they took them away. Now, it was not true that the federal government took the land. That was not part of what the federal government did. The War Relocation Authority, which was the federal authority over this process, they helped people sell things, but because they had to sell them so quickly, they were selling them at fire sale prices. People were selling refrigerators for $1 just to get some money. And some people had terrific neighbors who were saying, we're going to take care of your property. Some people had neighbors that came in and stole everything. Some people had everything set up and they had everything in storage and everything was going well, but the county they lived in found them in arrears for their taxes, and they couldn't get a hold of them in the camps, and they couldn't tell them taxes were due, and so consequently people fell behind on their taxes and had their businesses and farms and homes foreclosed by
Well, there's 100,000
county.
stories, and they're all different.
There's 110,000 stories of what happened.
This is another government propaganda film. This one, I didn't bother to put the audio on, but this was made specifically to talk about how good these people are. And part of the problem was there was fear that if the war kept going badly, that they would be wanting to round them up and be more barbaric to them.
Right.
So this is a family arriving, and it's a bad film, but it is color.
But the facilities, the first facilities they were taken to were generally racetracks. In our interviews, the people said that living in the racetracks.
This, by the way, is Northern California. There's Mount Shasta. This is Tule Lake.
That's Tule Lake. That the racetracks were particularly odious to stay in. Norman Mineta, who was Secretary of Transportation under George W. Bush, he was a congressman from San Jose. He was a young boy who was sent to the camps. But he said the first few weeks that they were sent to Santa Anita Racetrack were particularly bad. They had whitewashed the stalls and given these people cots in horse stalls to stay in.
And Norman Mineta, though, was a kid, and
Yes.
he was able to laugh at it, and he talked about, I shared the shower with Seabiscuit.
Yeah.
Which,
but he
that's
talked
not,
about
having a good attitude is how you get through hard times. And I
It's-
don't mean to diminish the hardships.
Yes. But then when they were moved, the camps were built.
Hold on a second. I want to, while you're talking about this is a picture of, this is Tanforan Park in San Bruno, California. You can see Mount San Bruno there near the airport. It's now a shopping center. But these were converted horse stalls. And one gentleman that we talked to talked about how he went in and he could see horse manure had been whitewashed over rather than cleaned off.
Right. That they didn't bother cleaning the crap out of the
stalls.
It had just been whitewashed.
It had been accommodations for one horse. It was now accommodations for a family. And of course, this may seem weird, but your wealth didn't matter. So rich people and poor people, you're in the same amount of space.
Right. Yeah. Everyone was, and it was noisy and crowded. But it took time to build the camps because they were in areas that nobody lived.
This is Manzanar, this is actually a photograph by Ansel Adams, which is why the mountains are so beautiful. I mean, it's a really desolate place, but it's still pretty striking.
When Norman Mineta his family was good at getting on the train to go to the camp, he wore his Cub Scout uniform because he wanted to show how loyal he was.
You can see those are Boy Scout uniforms there.
And he wanted to show his loyalty. And so he wore his uniform, but he also had his baseball mitt, his baseball, and his bat. And the guards took the bat away from him because they thought it was a weapon, because this 8-year-old boy was going to be dangerous with a baseball bat.
And you may recall he actually got it back.
Did he?
It was 1980s. He actually got it back. But so I wanted to. So some of the conditions in the camps, which were people adapted pretty well. They did what they could. But another thing which happened, which is curious, is art. There are a couple of really amazing photographers. This is the work of a woman named Dorothea Lange, who was very African. And this is a photograph of people lining up to register. And this is interesting. When you look in the archives, you can actually see there's a second shot here. And that guard cracks up.
Yeah, he's laughing, that he's trying to look real serious for the camera. The other photographer was a gentleman by the name of Clem Albers. He had been working for some of the local
mines. This is a Clem Albers photo. And you look at this story, and this is, to me, it's part of what we're talking about is how the art was used to communicate to people, how it spread the message. And it's part of the reason why we're having this conversation today, I think, is these images. Yes, this is military necessity. By the way, they didn't carry people very far in cattle cars. This was a short haul. It was not. The camps and this is an issue that actually has caused some controversy today. They've been called concentration camps because people were concentrated in it. That's the definition of the concentration camps. These were not Nazi death camps.
Right.
More people were born in them than died in them.
Yeah.
But that's not the issue.
That's not the issue. The issue was these people were taken from their homes and transported and forced to live in these camps, some up to 4 years.
Yes. Many of the others got out. I actually have
Now, I did want to talk about the idea of internment.
Go ahead. The legal concept?
There's a legal concept known as internment, in which the federal government is allowed to capture and detain aliens during times of war. This is perfectly legal. They are able to capture them and detain them, but they are given trials.
Or hearings, at least.
Or at least hearings.
And we did that even in the Revolutionary War. We've done it in every war except the Civil War.
This is the internment process, but it's only done on aliens. What happens in World War II, they did round up some of the Japanese aliens. These are people who ironically had lived in the United States much of their lives. Some of them had
They were not legally allowed to gain citizenship.
And they were not legally allowed to gain citizenship after 1924.
But please notice, this does not say no citizen. It says no person.
It says no person. And this is one of the very important points about it.
So
you want to talk about the
legalities?
Well, we've got a little bit of the legalities. How about the resistance?
I don't have much image. Let's move on to legalities because it's 10 minutes. So that's the Constitution. This is America. There are lawyers in America. There are lots of lawyers in America. And one of the early heroes was a gentleman by the name of Wayne Collins.
He was a West Coast lawyer for the ACLU.
He was a there he is.
And he was looking to find a way to fight this process because he thought it was wrong. And so he found a young man by the name of Fred Korematsu, and tried to use Fred Korematsu as a test case.
Korematsu is an interesting guy. He was a welder. It's one of the reasons why I find his story so compelling is he's an ordinary guy who basically said, and he was like 20, he had a girlfriend. He didn't want to leave his girlfriend. Yeah, hormones at that age. He said, why should I have to go when they don't have to go? This is dumb. He was arrested and he said, give me a lawyer. And I love this story because he was an ordinary guy who fought the system.
Right.
So Wayne Collins, who was a legendary lawyer, fierce fighter, had the foulest mouth in Washington, D.C., takes his case all the way to the Supreme Court and says, the argument is, you can't round up people on the basis of race and
hold them indefinitely.
And remove them from their homes.
Right.
You cannot remove. And the Supreme Court listened to this, considered it carefully, and said, oh, yes, we can.
Yes. They voted unanimously.
No, it wasn't unanimous. I'm sorry.
Yes, it was. Anyway.
We'll look it up. I'm pretty sure it wasn't unanimous.
U.S. versus Korematsu.
Okay. So the decision was there. So you've got these camps. Now.
Oh, wait a minute. The other legal challenge.
You want to talk about Hirabayashi?
Yes.
Okay.
A second legal challenge was brought by a young student at University of Washington named Gordon Hirabayashi. He was a very young man at the time.
Yes, he became a very successful professor later in life. And he's the opposite of Korematsu, extremely educated, extremely knew exactly what he was doing, and said, we're going to bound a case.
And he wanted to oppose the case. He wanted to resist it. And so he worked with the American Friends Service, the Quakers, to gain representation. He had to walk around and find a cop to arrest him.
The cops kept saying, just go to bed, kid.
Yeah, and he was finally arrested, and his case went to trial, and he served a bit of time, and then he was sent to one of the camps. And then in the camps, there was something called the loyalty questionnaire. Can I talk a little bit about the No-No Boys?
Just be aware of the time. It's 7:51.
Yes. Okay. In the camps, after people had been there for a year or so, the federal government decided that they wanted to find out how loyal these people in the camps
The idea
were.
was we'll find out who's really loyal and we'll be able to let them go
Right.
sooner. Then we can at least only be keeping 30,000 people
Right.
instead of 110,000 people.
So the idea was, how do we test loyalty? Of course, by a multiple choice quiz. So they gave them the quiz, and two of the questions were, will you be loyal to the United States of America?
And forswear all allegiance to any foreign power, which
Right.
bothered people because they said, I never had any allegiance. What is there to forswear?
Yes, they were not had any allegiance to
And the other question?
Japan. Would you serve in the army?
Well, how did this affect Gordon Hirabayashi, who was a Quaker?
Gordon Hirabayashi was a Quaker. And so for those two questions, he answered no, no. A few people did answer no, no. These were called the no-no boys, and they were segregated in Tule Lake.
They went to a separate camp, which was the largest camp, had 18,000 people by
Right.
the end, which is far larger than any city in that county today.
Right. And they had riots about this because the government wanted to draft these men, and they wouldn't be drafted. And one of the women that we interviewed had lived in the Tule Lake camp. She was very careful to explain to us.
No.
She was?
She was.
Yeah. But she wasn't resisting the draft because they weren't drafting women. So her natural answer to that question was no. And she had no allegiance to Japan. So why would she
And
answer?
she said, my country doesn't want me. I'm angry. She said she was angry, which, okay.
But she talks about the during the riots, the guards came in and used tear gas. And she, very polite, older woman, said, you just don't forget that smell.
Can't get it out of your curtains.
Can't get it out of your curtains.
Okay. Hirabayashi's case goes to the Supreme Court. He loses.
He loses again. Yeah.
We get to what I find the most fascinating part of the story, and it's one that's not very often talked about. This is a gentleman by the name of James Purcell. He was another lawyer, San Francisco attorney, labor lawyer.
Mainly a labor lawyer.
Son of an Irish Catholic prison guard who felt that he had been discriminated against, and he just got livid and said, this is not going to happen. Told very powerful stories. We actually had the honor of meeting him.
Yeah, and interviewing him.
But Mr. Purcell said, we have to win this, and we have to give them a case that doesn't allow the court to look at anything else to say, well, yeah, but what he does. So he conducted a questionnaire, and he surveyed hundreds of people to find the perfect test case. And he settled on Mitsui Endo, who you see right here, who was a woman, which is safer for loyalty questions at that time.
She had been born in the United States.
She didn't speak Japanese
at all. She had no allegiances to Japan.
She had a brother in the army.
She had a brother in the army.
She was passionately Christian in some way, which was
she worked at the California Department of Motor Vehicles, or whatever it was called at the time.
And James Purcell argued this court case and said, this is a woman who, by every measure, is loyal.
Right.
Can you continue to detain her against her will? Right. So
this is, but okay, let me point out. Purcell argued the case. Mitsui Endo, he did not meet before the case. He argued it ex parte endo, is what you can look it up as, meaning that Purcell fired the case on behalf of Mitsui Endo.
She was an ordinary person. So Hirabayashi and Korematsu are more heroic. They've both gotten Presidential Medals of Freedom.
Yes.
Endo did not, because she was just a secretary.
But
she was a relatively passive. Purcell has always said that he never met her. Yeah. Historians say he did, that there's some case where they were actually together, but he didn't remember that.
Yeah.
But the point is, he constructed this case. So Korematsu had said, you can't remove me from my home. The case was worded specifically in Endo that says, you can't continue to hold her when she obviously doesn't pose a threat.
Right.
And under those terms, the Supreme Court unanimously said, yeah, we're busted.
Yes.
And that's, to me, part of the power of this story is that we've got, when you do it right, when you really carefully construct things, the system can still work.
Yes. It's the story of ex parte endo is pretty amazing. And it was neat to meet James Purcell and talk to him about it. He got really choked up about it. But he did.
And, well, remember, he made a lot of money off of the case.
No, not a dime. In fact, Purcell told us that his neighbors told him, because they had known that he was fighting this case, ex parte endo, his neighbors told him, if we ever see you out on your porch or on your balcony with a
Japanese person, but he didn't say Japanese person.
Didn't say Japanese person. We're going to shoot the Japanese person first.
Second, no, you first.
You first, and the Japanese person. Okay, so
anyway, I missed a picture that I wanted to show. The document on your left is the notice that was hung, which basically said, all persons of Japanese ancestry, alien and non-alien alike. Non-alien is such an ugly euphemism. But what I love about this picture, this is an assembly area in San Francisco, and over there on the right, you can see
a woman who's up higher than everybody else, and she's got a black box in her hand. That's Dorothea Lange. That's her camera.
For the record, we're supposed to pronounce it Lange. She was sort of passionate about that. You pronounce the E, Lange, but you pronounce it Lange.
If you know anything about photography, and there was a picture during the Depression of a mother and her kids, and the mother's looking absolutely distraught and looking over to the side. That is a Dorothea Lange picture.
Okay.
She was well known as someone who could speak about the oppressed through her photography. So that was one reason why bringing her to take pictures was a little bit maybe controversial.
I don't know.
It's hard to say.
Remember, the administration didn't want to be holding people in prison. It's expensive.
Right.
It's ugly. You need them for the war effort. They wanted to shut the Californians and the Washingtonians up and get rid of this problem. And it was a mess, and it was an ugly solution. But I wanted to wrap up with
what happens later.
Well, the question of, can this sort of thing happen again? Actually, what happened later, I do have another image I was going to show first. Sorry, that's ahead of time. But where's my pictures? I'm so terribly disorganized with my pictures.
Well, you've got them all organized. They're just, can only see a handful of them at the time.
Okay, so this was something that existed, the Japanese-American hunting license. And this is just an example of how crude we are. But obviously, something like this would not happen ever again. We don't do this. We wouldn't round people up.
No.
We would. Oh.
Oops.
Yeah.
Okay, well.
So I do think, yes, without eternal vigilance, it can still happen, that attitudes are still there.
Oh, Bud wants to know what happened to the camps. This is an interesting story. Many of the people who were in camps were highly educated, high school and college education, or some had been through part of high school and part of college. They were in demand in places like Chicago, working for RCA, working
if they were sponsored, they could leave the camps and they could go live as civilians in the rest of the country. If they were sponsored, they could also join the military.
Yes, and which they did in droves. The young men in America, the Japanese Americans joined the 442nd, which was one of the most highly
and a few
decorated.
other groups.
Yeah.
Okay, by the end of the war, by the time the Endo decision came down, the camps were mostly filled with very old, very young. The people who they had a use for could get out. And then 2 days before the Endo decision was announced, they leaked word to the administration, and the administration said, "Okay,
camps closed.
Camps closed.
Everybody goes home."
I believe some of them had to leave very quickly, and they took them a while to get their stuff together.
And there was a handful of people who were so frightened about going back that they committed suicide. One woman bludgeoned her 2 children to death with a hammer.
I don't like those stories.
Go back. It's really tragic. But they were so.
But they were welcomed back on the West Coast.
Oh, no.
Okay. Yeah. So it still takes time. Obviously, today, Japanese Americans are pretty well integrated in society. Mm-hmm. They're, a wealthy group of people. They're not poorer than other ethnicities.
But certainly after the war, they wanted to make sure this wasn't going to happen again. So the Japanese American Citizens League had been in place before the war, but they got very busy trying to go through and figure out a way to keep this from happening again. And one of the answers they came up with was redress. If you remember back to your high school civics lesson, there's this weird thing in the First Amendment about redress.
No person shall be denied the right of speech, liberty, blah, or to petition the government for the redress of grievances.
Yeah.
Now, okay. Now, this is a controversial issue. I didn't know we were going to go here. I didn't prepare any slides because there are, certainly there are some people who say, well, we can't afford that.
Yes.
And you gave the same money to the rich as you gave to the poor.
Right.
But does it make up for it?
But this will lead in 1982, 83, it's going to lead to Senate hearings. 1982, there will be an enterprising law professor from San Diego named Peter Irons, who is going to try to get presidential pardons for people like Hayashi.
They did not get pardons. He got the case overturned.
Okay.
That was actually, now that's,
all right,
it's a fun little story, but it's kind of a side tangent that what happened essentially. Eddie Ennis, who was the director for alien internment,
during World War II,
assisted Peter Irons and another person, found a document that said that the case presented in Hirabayashi and in Korematsu, there had been some documents falsified.
Right.
And based on that, they actually got the convictions overturned.
Okay.
It was a symbolic victory. Obviously, that was long over. Eddie Ennis was the gentleman who...
What? You're going to tell that story?
Well, just this fact.
We interviewed Eddie Ennis in his
New York apartment in 1990 approximately.
Yeah.
He was telling us the story about working with how J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, had basically, he wasn't a great fan of civil rights, but he opposed the internment actions because he said, there were some potentially disloyal. I got them all. We had our hearings. They're done. You're making me look bad.
Yeah, it made J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI look bad by rounding everybody up. So
Eddie Ennis and Francis Biddle, the Attorney General, are flying to visit a camp on the West Coast.
Yes. All right. They have to go visit a camp on the West Coast. At the time, no jet aircraft. You had to fly from the East Coast, stop in Chicago, and spend the night, and then fly out the next morning.
I've done that.
Anyway,
so they're basically in the room. They're having a few drinks, which is what these educated people did.
Yes, they're sitting around like the Thin Man movie and having cocktails of the evening.
And after 2 drinks, Francis Biddle turns to Edward Ennis and says, "Eddie, do you think that Edgar Hoover?"
J. Edgar.
No, he called him Edgar.
Oh, okay.
He said, "Do you think Edgar Hoover is a homosexual?"
And Eddie Ennis paused for a few breaths and then asked Francis Biddle, "Francis, who got us these rooms?"
"Well, the Chicago head of the FBI. The FBI set up these rooms for us."
And Eddie Ennis
paused
and then said, "Good night, Francis. I'm going to bed."
Has nothing to do with our story. It's just
that's a great.
It's a story I love to share.
That's a love story. I
love
that story.
So I think we're going to wrap it up.
But here's the end of the congressional hearings, the 1983 hearings. Is that in 1988, President Reagan at the time signed the
redress bill.
The redress bill, and everybody.
And
who had
there
been
is something
camps,
to say about this, which is, there's questions over, does everybody who suffered 30, 40 years ago deserve it? But because the government had to pay, this is one of the reasons, it's like punitive damages. Right. Suddenly you're going to think twice about doing that. Exactly. And that's one of the reasons why I think, you can't pay anybody the right amount for everybody for this amount of time.
Yeah,
but if you put a price tag on this and the government has to say, if we do this again, if we round up all the Muslims and put them in camps, we may have to pay a lot of money down the road.
Now, this didn't happen after 9/11. And one of the reasons why it didn't happen was, of course, President Bush's Secretary of Transportation, a fellow by the name of Norman Mineta, who was in the cabinet meetings. He explained what the internment process was, and he said, "You better not do that to the Muslims." And I think
because it can happen again.
Because it can happen again. And so this was an important point that came out of that.
So we start off with a look at our basic 4 premises, the 4 excuses: military necessity. Nope. No, there was no military. Race prejudice.
Yep.
Definitely. War hysteria. When we were doing our research on this, I do remember that one older woman said, "You've got to understand how scared we were."
Yeah.
And while that doesn't excuse it, we should be aware of that. And if anything, it's just as when you're in a situation where you're exposed to, if you're exposed to a temptation you don't think you can handle, if you had a few drinks, you don't get in the car, you don't expose yourself to situations. You have constitutional protections to keep you from doing something stupid when you're hysterical.
And we, during, the few days after 9/11, 2001, people were scared. And, there was a chance that something like that could have happened.
All right.
And thank goodness that didn't.
So I think we should call it a night and say thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for talking about this.
Is there anything else we need to cover? We pretty much got everything.
We covered the story. The basic story that I really had wanted to emphasize was still this one of these different things, and the fact that, the failure of political leadership to me is still the big one. Have the courage
to stand up.
If your soldiers are going to risk their lives, you can risk your career. That's true today. That's true when we have people faced with congressional things and saying, "Well, I don't want to buck my party."
And if you recall the Bush administration, his attorney general, you went through and said, "Oh, okay, all of this is legal. I've just decided all of this waterboarding and everything is legal."
Okay.
And so,
All right.
It can happen again. So we have to be careful.
Let's say goodnight to these nice people.
Anyway, thank you so much for being here. We sure appreciate it. If you have any questions,
comments, likes, we got 2 likes. Come on, let's get that up to 3.
All right.
All right, a little like, okay.
Anyway,
Good night, ladies and gentlemen.
Good night, everybody.